Hi, welcome to the Saskatchewan Festival of Words Slam panel. My name is Nisha, and I'll be introducing and moderating the panel today. We have two amazing poets lined up for you, but first I want to acknowledge that we are on traditional lands referred to as Treaty 4, and that this festival is also usually located on Treaty 4. However, today these authors will be coming to you from all over Canada, the original lands of the Cree, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect and honor the treaties that were all made on territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we are committed to move forward in partnership with Indigenous nations in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. This festival is dedicated to making a safe space for everyone. Any hateful language will not be tolerated in the events or in the chat on YouTube. Also, the festival would not be possible without the support of our major funders. So we would like to thank the Saskatchewan Arts Board, Sask Culture, Saskatchewan Lotteries, Canada Council for the Arts, the Government of Canada, as well as a long list of program funders that will be shown at the end of the event. And if you're a business that knows that you know wants to support the festival, please be in touch. We will gladly accept more sponsors in the future. So what we're going to do today is we're going to introduce each of the poets who will be speaking, and then we're going to get into kind of the nature of spoken word and really ask some questions about what it's like to be a spoken word poet in Canada. So our first poet up is going to be Namitha Rathina Pillai, and she is a Tamil Canadian published spoken word poet, writer, and workshop facilitator. She is based in Ottawa and is the first female and youngest director of the Urban Legends Poetry Collective. Namitha is also a good friend, and she is an amazing poet. We are super honored to have her today. Amna Mohammed was born and raised in Edmonton. Her parents are both immigrants from Somalia, and her poetry has themes of home, belonging, and the struggle of reconciling her culture with who she has become. Amina is a writer of words, a student of history, and is committed to changing the world around her. Both of these poets come from different experiences in spoken word, and I'm so happy that they'll be coming together to share their ideas and be in conversation with each other. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome Namitha now to share her work with the festival.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nisha. So first, I'd like to acknowledge that the land that I'm currently on, which is colonially known as Ottawa, is on traditional Algonquin Anishinaabe land. So I'm going to get started with my first two poems. So my first poem is called Revolving Door Father. My father, devout Hindu, sits at an AA meeting like he is the god these worshippers came here to pray to. Like he is better than them. Like he did not seek solace at the bottom of a bottle too. He stumbles in and falls on his knees, and I do not know if it is for prayer or for forgiveness or whether there is at all a difference. My father finishes a bottle and hoses down his sins at the foot of a shrine of a god who is not my mother. All the liquid courage in the world, and he is still a coward. He gambles away my tuition and slurs that I am lucky to have him as a father, that I will never have one better than him. And this insult hurts me the most, that I will never have one better than him. He does not do the steps, does not ask for my forgiveness. Maybe he knows it is too late in the night to be coming home, too late in my life to ask for his fatherhood back. That I am a clock that strikes 2:50, all arms outstretched and waiting for him to come home. But maybe on a stool at the bar, letting his apologies be washed away by the beer and looking up at the clock, he believes he is home. When my mother hears me use a crowbar that I save in the back of my throat only to speak about my father, she says I am being dramatic. When I tell my mother of my pain, she rivals me with hers, recounts the story of how she lost her father at the age of 5. It is her way of telling me she only ever wants to give me what she did not have. She tells me that she always wanted a father. I tell her me too. I remind her that when a stranger broke into our home, shattering the window in the middle of our door with his closed fist, it was her and I that muddled through the broken glass. I tell her cleaning up another man's mess is something that feels all too familiar, and she says I am being dramatic. She says he is blood, and he is, and the crowbar in the back of her throat pries a nailed wooden crate, and it escapes what she means to say. She means to say that he is blood on her hands. I tell my mother that she is wrong, that I am blood on his hands, that all of Neptune's ocean could not wash the blood off his hands. I tell my mother that being a victim is not a sin and she does not choose to hear me. I tell my mother a father is not the man that makes you question if you are worthy of love. He is the one who proves it to you. My father, devout Hindu, believes in a father more than I do. Thank you. And for my second poem, I will do one called Piano Fingers. Piano fingers, how I love the way you play me. The way your fingers touch all the right keys, sustained notes reverberate inside. The way you look up at me when you know you are sight reading a new piece and I am applauding with my open mouth. You are crafting a sonata when you play me and know which chord will make my back arch, which will leave me with a desert mouth praying for a rainfall to satisfy this dry season. You mad artist. You scratch at the page, crossing out old bars that no longer fit this song and filling in empty bars with notes that sit right with a leaky pen. And I am not afraid to be covered in ink. You make a masterpiece of my body, and it is the instrument you know how to play best. This traveling show does not have an audience, but it is a full house. You bring me to the bathroom counter and keep the mirror facing you so that you can practice your fingering for this new piece. See the reaction of the crowd in the reflection. See your own reaction in the reflection. You know the melody so well, you begin to sing it as you play. You mouth the words with me. This duet has always been a duet, even when we have been played by other hands, by other lovers, by other instruments. But now, with you, every night is opening night, but the song is always different. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. And I'm gonna ask Amina to come and share her words with us.
Hi, my name is Amina. I live here in Nimiskwichi, Waskahigan on Treaty 6 territory, the ancestral and traditional territory of the Cree, Dene, Blackfoot, Saulteaux, Nakota Sioux, and the Métis. So I only have one poem for you guys tonight. I don't have a name for it, but I'll read it to you anyways. I break my bones and piece them back together in the syllables of my name. I give them to you on a gold platter smeared with ash from a shelled-out home, on a continent that begins and ends with the letter A. My name begins and ends with the letter A. My name begins millennia ago and ends when I say it does. It began when the ink of my mother's pen touched the page and ends when my grandmother smiles. My braids are like vines that twist and turn down the curve of my back and snake out from my bobblehead. They hiss and they spit at the wandering hands. I wish I could turn them to stone. Medusa was a black woman. No wonder they hated her. Did she love herself as I do? Her snake hair and burning coal eyes. Perseus took her head and her hair and he wore her as a shield. I wish I was her. My Medusa eyes, burning holes in sweater vests and wandering fingers. I wish I could meet her. I wish I could tell her that I love her, and I wish I could tell her that I saw her, that somebody knew her story years later and a world away. Sometimes I think my bobblehead with its braid vines will roll off the stump of my neck, dragged off by the weight of their own thoughts. Sometimes I think my brain will never stop working. Medusa was a black woman, and so am I, and so is my mother, and so were her sisters when they were stripped of their teeth and their hair and their eyes. If I could, I would tell her that her snakes and her hair, like this hair and this body, come from a mother's love. I would tell her that she could turn men to stone because her ancestors wanted her to be safe. I would tell her that a man will write your history, but I will tell your story 1,000 times, 1,000 different ways. I would tell you that your descendants slept underwater, but they woke up to green fields and kaleidoscope flowers. I would tell you that they thought of you when they jumped ship and swam for safer shores. I would tell you that they thought of you when their children grew up motherless. I would tell you that I thought of you. And I would tell you that I love you, because I know that you love me. Thank you.
Beautiful. Okay, so we're gonna get into the panel, and I have some questions for you guys, so you can take turns responding to them. We'll go back and forth, just to keep things nice and clean. You don't know it, but we have about 30 to 40 people right now watching your session, so that's very exciting. And yeah, let's just get into it. So I want you to begin by describing to us what your practice of spoken word means. Let's start with Namitha.
Sorry, unmuting is a whole time. Anyway, I think my practice of spoken word is basically just kind of prioritizing and valuing the sharing of lived experience. I think for me, that's how spoken word, the impact of spoken word really started for me, was seeing that there was a place that I could have support and community and solidarity in talking about parts of myself that I didn't feel comfortable expressing in any other medium except for spoken word. So I think that that practice that obviously like has been around for so long and has developed in several ways. I think the way that it has withstood time, I think, is its meaning to me.
For me, I guess spoken word it's so much of like my history and like my family's history. And when I started to do spoken word, it was just kind of like a natural progression because my sister did spoken word, my grandmother did spoken word, I don't know how many great grandmothers and grandfathers also did poetry, but it's just such a big part of me in my past that I know that when I wanted a medium for me to be able to tell my story and control how much I want people to know about me and how much I want them to know about what how I feel and like how I don't know how to explain it, but it's just like it's a place for me to tell my story and my history and my past and put it into a place that will last for the future and is also in the present.
I guess you guys both come from like two different traditions of entering poetry. Can you tell me what starting was like? Even like for you, Amina, coming from a culture of poetry is different for you, Namitha, that like you discovered it for yourself and you made it something that became a part of your life. So let's start with Amina.
Well, for me, I guess, like I said, spoken word has always been a big part of my life in whatever form that it came in. Like in Somalia, we have at weddings we have this thing called Burambud, and basically it's a circle where we all come and we dance, and there's a woman who's saying the words and she's singing, and it's kind of in like a poem format. So even if I didn't know that it was poetry, and even if I didn't know that what I was doing, what the people around me were doing with poetry, poetry has always just been there for me to express myself in. Kind of, yeah. So getting into it was not that hard because it was just me going into my past and finding like what my sister's doing and doing it for myself because I've always been a writer.
Definitely. Of course, like Nisha said, I think that um, based on the privilege that I have of being able to discover spoken word, something that's existed for so long. For me, it started. I was taking a writer's craft class in which we'd chosen each student would choose a style of writing and then was asked to present on the style of writing and then ultimately write a piece in that style. So I chose spoken word, honestly, just because button poetry was super big at the time and like obviously still is. But I was kind of dominating in the field of spoken word and was kind of the easiest access point for me as someone who didn't, who isn't a part of that culture, like naturally. So I really just sought out spoken word opportunities in the city of Ottawa. So spaces like Urban Legends, which I now direct, was really that kind of launching pad for me for developing my voice in spoken word and ultimately kind of having that sense of community with other poets.
And I think that's really interesting that you both come from community and that you mentioned community, because I think one of the things that differentiates page poetry from spoken word poetry is that you can't really do spoken word alone or in isolation, whereas like a lot of page poets write poetry on their own and they never share it with anyone, you know, or it takes them many years before they do. So tell the audience, I guess, for you, what the difference between spoken word is from traditional page poetry. Traditional in the sense of not our traditions.
I think that to me, it feels a lot more accessible because I feel like, at least in my experience, a lot of the times with page poetry, you end up with it's a very white centric space. You have folks that have the power to, publish you or not publish you are often white, and often their reading of your work ends up going through this filter where it's basically sifted into, okay, is this person palatable or not? Is this someone I want to publish? And it ends up being this very um, vulnerable experience of like taking your very intimate like lived experience and leaving it up for consumption in a way that I don't feel with spoken word. I feel like when I'm in a spoken word space, one, because of its roots, it ends up being obviously in different spaces, it's dependent, but I feel a lot more comfortable as a poet talking about my identity and my body and those kinds of topics, and I don't feel the need to dilute it or water it down in the same way that I often feel with page poetry. But in general, it feels a lot more accessible. There's always spaces for spoken word, whether that's something that's a lot more established, like a poetry collective. A lot of the times there's usually a big one in the city, but there's obviously smaller ones if that's more intimidating or you can't access it for whatever reason. But yeah, I think in general, it just feels a lot more accessible and less of a ladder to climb.
Just like piggybacking off of what Namitha said, I feel like a spoken word definitely is way more accessible because, for me at least, what I've seen of page poetry, it's really easy for it to become kind of hierarchical with like the good poets and like the bad poets. But in spoken word, like you can just go to an open mic and start speaking, and everyone there is so nice, they're so welcoming. They're gonna hype you up afterwards. You're gonna hype you up while you're doing it too. So like spoken word, like the community is just like so great and so welcoming. That's something that you can't get with page poetry because when the people you're interacting with generally happens over email, or they're editors who are white and don't understand your experience and want to, like Namitha said, make you more palatable for white audiences because that's who they're catering to. But when you're speaking to a group of people who look like you and sound like you at an open mic, at least from what I've seen, it's way easier for you to do.
And I think it's very important when we talk about community to kind of reference the history of spoken word. So one of the things that maybe not everyone in the audience knows is that spoken word comes from a Black tradition. It is essentially a Black art form that kind of crossed North America through dissemination from many different poets, right? So it wasn't just Black poets who started practicing spoken word, but the roots are still very much in the Black arts. And so for both of you, coming from both a Black culture but also a non-Black tradition, what is it like for you to honor this and carry the weight of that honor throughout your work? Let's start with Amina.
Okay. I feel like a lot of the things that I speak about in my poetry and a lot of the themes that I go into isn't something that my ancestors would have gone into and something that they would have written about. But I think that there's power in knowing in knowing where what you're doing comes from, and knowing that when you're doing it, you're doing the same thing that the people who came before you did. And it's very, very, it changes the way that I look at poetry and also changes the way that I look at my own poetry, knowing that when I'm doing this, I'm like physically carrying on the heritage, my own heritage, even though I live in Canada, not in Somalia, obviously.
I think what's really rad is I feel like I think that your point, Amna, about like the knowledge of knowing where things come from, I think that it's interesting that I feel like is the root of how I've educated myself about the roots of spoken word. Is there is power in knowing where it's from, and there's power in knowing that it's not mine, and that this isn't something that I have entitlement to. So I think for me, a lot of the time, it's that kind of knowledge and taking that, and not just sitting on that knowledge, obviously, but using that knowledge to make space and be aware of the space that's also taken away from Black spoken word artists. But also on the topic of knowledge, Jamal Jackson Rogers, who's the former poet laureate of Ottawa, actually taught a class at Carleton about spoken word and kind of like its roots and where it came from. And for me, taking that course was a big step in kind of unlearning and relearning a lot of what I thought about spoken word, and also having those kinds of difficult and uncomfortable conversations about my space in spoken word circles and what it means that I take up space in those circles.
I think it's very important, yeah, to acknowledge kind of those traditions and recognize that like the work is ongoing of making sure we dismantle racism and anti-Blackness and anti-Indigeneity in our practices. And in that same vein, like I find that a lot of spoken word is really centered on justice, on social issues, on kind of the big things of the day, as well as kind of like the deeply personal. So how do you feel you've grown through sharing spoken word poetry with an audience?
I think that the way I've grown is I think one, I've gotten more comfortable sharing personal experiences, but at the same time, I've gotten really comfortable with where that boundary needs to be for me to share it in a healthy and productive way. I think that a lot of the time when folks enter spoken word circles through that kind of like non-traditional colonial way of like discovering it the same way that I did, there's this huge emphasis on like trauma poetry and really like laying yourself bare for consumption. And I think that it ends up with, especially when you get into slam scenes and getting scores for your poetry, I think that a lot of folks go into like really dangerous spaces where they're sharing information that they haven't, or like sharing experiences that they haven't healed from and things they aren't actually comfortable sharing. And it ends up being really, really personally detrimental. So I'm very lucky that I have not had a situation that has, I think, impacted me as violently. But I think that just in general, there have definitely been times where I've shared a poem and I've like never shared that poem ever again because I've known like this is not productive. And also, I think knowing that in sharing, there is a certain responsibility, I believe, to take care of your audience. So I think that a lot of the times when folks share really, really traumatic experiences, shaping it in a way that maybe isn't diluting the experience, but also isn't just trauma dumping to the folks that are listening to your poetry. So I think just like boundaries for both yourself and the audience have definitely been something that I've learned through personal experience, but also through just being in poetry spaces and watching other poets.
I think for me, like, there's always, like, obviously you're always gonna somehow get into a situation where you're listening to somebody's poem and they're telling you their trauma, and obviously you don't want to take away from that, but I feel like when I'm listening to poetry, I appreciate trigger warnings beforehand, and I try to do that before I start speaking on something that's sensitive to me or a topic that I know that might affect other people who are listening. So I always try to make sure to do that. Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, basically, what do you think has led to your growth, or how have you grown through the practice of sharing often very vulnerable work?
I think even just in the act of writing the poem helps me work through issues that I have and feelings that I'm having. And even if I don't end up sharing that with people because I feel like it's too personal, then it helps me. Just like the process of going through it helps me. And also, I feel like when there's a space where you're sharing your trauma, you have to you need to feel, in order for you to feel like you're valid, you need to tell somebody your trauma, like especially with BLM going around, when you're trying to explain a situation to somebody who might not support the Black Lives Matter movement or who doesn't understand why you don't feel comfortable around police officers. You have to share your trauma in order for them to see you as somebody who has value. But then with poetry, that's not the case, because you can talk about whatever the hell you want in your poetry. So if I want to speak about my trauma, I know the people that are going to be there to support me. And if I don't want to speak about it, I'm still valid and my poetry still matters. So learning that has really helped me with my spoken word poetry.
And I think those are both like very important considerations. And I think oftentimes spoken word is associated with like the very deeply personal and with the disclosure of trauma. One of the things that I think really sets spoken word apart from page poetry is that you are engaging with like a human face, right? With a human person. So it becomes very easy to empathize and to show compassion, you know, in a way, which is really interesting. I think it's funny that this is called a slam panel. So traditionally, this time in July at the Festival of Words in Moose Jaw would have been a poetry slam night. And it's one of the biggest events of the entire festival. It's often very high energy. It's a lot of fun. And moving to the online panel is kind of different, but at the same time, it's interesting because this is not a slam. So I think I'm just going to take a little bit to explain what slam is versus what spoken word is. So spoken word is the art form. This is the poetry that we're doing. And slam is the competition of spoken word. And so there are no slam poets, there are spoken word poets who participate in slam. So for both of you coming from different levels of experience within slam, what has the competition taught you if you have participated before?
I don't remember if I went first. I mean, it's okay if I go.
No, you can go ahead.
Okay, cool. I think that there was a lot that I learned from doing that experience, but also I think that the idea of competition, I think naturally makes a person want to be better, whatever that might be, you know, whether that's being more comfortable in that kind of high energy competitive space, whether that's a higher score, which is completely arbitrary, but that's its own thing. I think that it is a place for that kind of self-growth, but also I think it can be, especially if you're someone who does these, you know, really vulnerable poems about, especially about yourself, to be scored on that is a very, very, it's a very difficult balance of not letting that impact your vision or your reflection on that experience, to be like, oh, well, that trauma that I went through, that was only like a 7.5. I think that knowing your experience, knowing the value that you bring to that stage, regardless of your score, I think is really important. But I do think it's a space that, I mean, it's fun. I think it's like, that's what draws, I think, poets to this space, is it's this idea of this kind of like gamification of poetry as this competition where you can score and you can, you know, go head to head, or you can, I don't know, I think that that is the draw, is that kind of idea that you can win a slam. But at the same time, obviously, if you're sharing really vulnerable pieces, I think that there really needs to be a sense of self-assurance and knowledge that this isn't someone giving you a score as a person on your experience, but rather the delivery of the poem itself.
And Amina, you said earlier that like you never slammed before. And the reason I wanted to include you in the panel is just like, you've seen a lot of slam. So what is it like for you? Have you considered doing slam in the future? Like, what does it mean for your poetry in the future?
Well, for me, I have watched slam poetry, but my background is really in like speech and debate competitions. So I remember I'm not good at speech, like, at all. I'm very, very bad at speech competitions. Debate competitions, on the other hand, I'm amazing at those. But speech competitions, my first one, I read a poem by Wada Sinchita, if you don't know who Wada Sinchita is, she's an amazing Somali poet, and I like really, really love her poetry. And I was reading one of her poems out, and I remember at the end, this white guy, who's an old white man, I think he was like no offense to him, but he was like in his 50s. And he said to me, he was like, doesn't seem like you really connected to the piece. It doesn't seem like you really understood what she was talking about in the poem. And I was like, I feel like I understand my own history and my country's history better than you do. And I was so deeply, deeply offended by how he said that to me. And the fact that he said, I don't think you really connect to this piece, that I don't think I'll ever be able to do slam poetry, putting my poetry out there and saying, this is like something I'm so proud of, and then having some random person say, actually, it's not that good, and actually, I don't appreciate you telling me your trauma like that. So I don't know if I'll ever be able to do slam poetry, but I doubt it.
Yeah, and I think it's just so fascinating because especially now, so much of slam is that live, in person. You know, we picked judges from the audience. These are people who wandered in off the street and suddenly they have to listen to poems, like this really visceral element to slam. And I've seen slams move online and it's a totally different game. you know, and what I've seen is that it's been really humanizing, right? You see people as people, you listen to words instead of necessarily their body language, and it's been a removal of a barrier to entry, you know. And I think that's a common theme within spoken word communities, where there are so few barriers to entry that almost anyone can go into a scene and like continue to be a part of that community. So all very important. I'm going to read a quote for you guys, and I hope that you can maybe respond to it a little bit. So this is how it goes. Poems do not endure as objects, but as presences. When you read anything worth remembering, you liberate a human voice. You release into the world again a companion spirit. I read poems to hear that voice, and I write to speak to those I have heard. And this is Louise Gluck. So what kind of voices do you think are being heard in your work, and whose voices are you responding to?
Well, obviously in my work, what you hear is my story and my words. And I know that even in like 100, 200 years, if somebody manages to find my poetry somehow, they'll be able to read it and say, hey, this is about a girl who lived here and here at this time, and this is her experience, and this is what she did. And I'm not one to really talk about leaving a legacy or whatever, because I don't think that you have to do something like significant or whatever in your life for you to matter after you die. But poems and like writing, like the feeling that you get when you read a letter that somebody wrote back in like the 16th century, whatever. I'm a history student, by the way, so I'm like really into, you know, like going to like historical sites and reading historical things and be able to like hear that these people existed and they were really there at that time, like living their lives, is just so crazy to me because it's not something that you ever see. So I know that when somebody hears my poetry, like down the line, they'll know that I existed and this is what I left and this is the story that I'm giving you.
Yeah, definitely. I think also that element of a presence is really to me what spoken word brings versus page poetry, is that idea of like it's humanizing. Like Nisha said, you're feeling this person's energy, how they're articulating these words, what is their intonation, what are their word choices. And I think especially when you hear um, poems, just I think that there's something to be said about that kind of very personal connection it feels like you have when you are listening to someone perform a poem. But I think for me, as for my voice, it's deeply me. I don't think it's like personally, I don't think it's fair to write about other people's experiences. So my poems are deeply personal. But I think it took me a long time in my poetry career to realize that I didn't only need to write about my identity to be valued as a woman of color. I think that in being in these spaces, it is inherently political, and it is inherently it's inherently political to take up spaces um, in these spaces, to take up space. I think regardless of what you're actually doing your poetry about, I think is really important. And it was a big lesson for me to not feel as though I had to lay bare my trauma or my experience for consumption to just write about, like, I don't know, flowers and be like, oh, cool. I, as a brown woman, have endured all this much and have gotten to a space where I can feel as though as whatever I'm writing is influenced by my life experience. So a little not so much articulate, but yeah, definitely, definitely I think that life experience definitely informs that.
Cool. And I guess I have a few more questions. Let's start with this one. What is kind of, and I know this is asking a lot, what are some of the biggest, wildest dreams you have for your work while you are alive and performing it?
I think for me, some of those wild, I think it's really nice to indulge in what feels like a wild dream, because I think also it like sounds kind of cheesy, but I think as a kid to even like, I was someone who tried to make myself sick when I was 5 if I had like an oral presentation. So the fact that I'm even like doing this kind of work is monumental to me. But I think that those kinds of crazy dreams are, one, being able to sustain myself as an artist full time, I think is the wildest dream. And also to do that in a way where I don't feel like I'm compromising my creativity and feeling that I need to have that on demand, I think to me is honestly the wildest dream. But also, I think to do a poetry tour would be really rad. I think those are probably my my wildest dreams as an artist and as a poet.
For me, I don't know. My poetry, I've only been doing it for about like almost 2 years at this point. But I think the craziest thing that could happen out of my poetry is me publishing a chapbook and, like Namita said, like going on a tour because I've never been to America. So like going to the United States as a person who's like performing my poetry and being able to make money off of my art full time would be like amazing. Not even full time, even part time. I don't care. Like that would be amazing.
Cool. I think it's really important for us to consider art and poetry and the role these things play in the revolution. And I'm going to leave that like purposefully vague, so you can interpret the revolution as much as you want. But kind of, what do you think? What do you think the role of poetry is going to be in your revolution?
Information, I feel like. For me, when I think of the word revolution, I think of like when you look, I keep talking about this, but when you look at like the Black Lives Matter movement in like here in Alberta and even like in America and in Canada in general, there's so many things that have already been changed. And one thing that I would love to see done through spoken word poetry is people being able to give out information that way and also giving the platform to more non-white spoken word poets and Black spoken word poets and giving people the money and the support that they need to be able to do what they want and do what they need to be doing as poets and as spoken word poets. That doesn't involve always having to bring, like, I hate to say this, but it's also very true. Like, that doesn't involve having to bring white people into our spaces. So a lot of the time, these companies are looking and being like, how can we diversify? How can we support Black people so it looks like we actually care? Like, a lot of the time, we do not need you to like try and bring us into your space as an afterthought. What we need is for you to support us in the spaces that we've already made and the spaces that we have already doing. So give us the space to do what we need to do, and give us the space to make money and to be poets.
Yeah, honestly, going off that, I think the idea of, especially if you're consuming this poetry essentially for free, if you're an audience member and you're not financially supporting these people, it's exploitation. It like that's all it is. And I think that to revolutionize what it means to support BIPOC and especially Black and Indigenous folks is to, one, financially contribute to, if you are consuming their art, to financially contribute to them in a way that is reasonable and makes that sustainable. But I also think that spoken word started as a space for the oppressed to share their experiences, because history isn't written by the oppressed, it's written by the oppressors. And I think that the power that that has is monumental. And I think that that kind of just going on that kind of role of really giving a platform for those voices as knowledge sharing is really important.
Beautiful. I have one last question, and then I'm going to ask you both to share a concluding poem before we get to the Q&A. And I think the biggest question I have is really like, what do you think is going to happen to Canadian spoken word in the coming years?
I mean, I don't know if I can speak to what I think is going to happen, but I can speak to what I hope is going to happen. And I think that that's honestly what I mentioned in the previous answer is I think that kind of long-term sustainability for BIPOC folks and specifically Black and Indigenous folks, I think is really important. I think to exploit Black folks in a space that they created is so violent and so harmful. And I think that the fact that this has been happening for so long and continues to, I think is really upsetting. And I think that I hope that this kind of, these changes that companies and folks are trying to make right now with the movement and the momentum that BLM has had, I hope doesn't just become a trend and becomes this kind of long-term sustainable support of these folks that have been doing the work for so long.
Well, in the future, what I want to see is for there to be more grants specifically for Black and Indigenous people and specifically for people of color, because especially in from what I've seen, there's so many spaces that were meant for Black people or were meant for BIPOC and were colonized and taken apart and dismantled, and now they're not there anymore. So what I hope to see is for there to be more money, more support from non-Black people and from people of color for the arts in their cities, and also for Namitha said, if you're watching poets and if you're consuming content from BIPOC, to make sure that you're supporting them and you're giving them money, because a lot of the time, a lot of us are broke, we don't have money, and if you're watching our poetry for free and if you're just coming and not supporting us, we're struggling. So if you really are about it and you really want to make a difference or whatever, support us, give us money in material ways, give us spaces to perform, give us platforms like this.
Beautiful. Yeah, I'm going to invite you guys to share one more poem. So Namitha, would you like to go first?
Yeah, definitely. When someone says you fight like a girl, say thank you. You see, everything about being a woman is about fight. Woman, by definition, is treading on ground that wants to swallow you whole. Every step we take is an act of rebellion, but this quicksand existence is a death sentence. Every word we speak is a battle cry to be heard. Every breath we take is too much space. We are taught from a young age that we take up too much space. They say boys hang lower in the womb. How do they exercise freedom they do not yet know of? Woman, by definition, is the realization that yelling fire instead of rape is more effective, because our bodies are worth less than objects, but we are treated as objects used and abused. They break our hymens and spirits in the same assault. And when we speak up to say that we are worth more than nothing, it is a political statement that is somehow still disagreed upon. Instead, they treat us like flowers pressed between the pages of a book. Told we are beautiful and then asphyxiated into darkness. What good is beauty if I am no longer alive? Uncredited sources and unpaid hours. Do I still make a sound if no one is around to avow me? To be woman is to play a lifelong game of mercy measured by a yardstick of suffering. You are to put your hand in the mouth of trauma and be praised for how long you could stand it. In the dark corner of the world, to be woman is to go from open legs to open casket, fresh sheets to tuck you in 6 feet deep in the hopes that the dirt will mother you better than this world ever could. This Holocaust of women has become less sadness and more statistic. Men name ships and war machines after women because their jaws gape, and the first thing they think of when they see such power is woman. So why is loving yourself treated more like a milestone of maturity and not something we should be born doing? We are only reminded that we are worth something when we are a belonging. To be someone's mother or sister or daughter, to be of proximity becomes our shelter. But as we sit in the shackles of misogyny, men are reminded of their privilege delicately. Coddled into passivity, privilege is having both the messenger and the message accommodate to you. To tiptoe around the reality is to dance on the ashes of those that did not survive it. To be woman is to be both the bullet and the teeth clenching it. So when someone says you fight like a girl, say thank you. You see, everything about being a woman is about fight.
So the poem that I have is once again untitled. I don't title my poems, I just number them. So here we go. My family is an ocean away, and my ancestors are buried in a sun-scored desert with cracked red earth, and houses built with burnt blocks of stone. I live in white fields with crisp, clear air cold enough to burn my lungs and my lips, wrapped in a down-filled black coat and under the same blue sky and yellow sun, and a home built by wood-brown beams and white plaster. Coming home is walking through green grass barefoot on a summer's day. It is seeing green trees outside my window. I wasn't born into colorful gem-colored trashes and outdoor markets, or into family living across the street, close enough to touch and to hug, or history from ancestors long dead, watching from a distance. Instead, I have family living worlds away, and tinny voices filtered through a phone speaker. I was born into gray snow and dirty slush, not a blue ocean and white streets. Some days I feel like I'm caught in a dance I don't know the steps to, twisting and turning faster and faster, singing words that feel unfamiliar and clumsy on my tongue. It feels like the flowers I stuff between my ribs, poking through my skin and out into the air. It is the heaviness in every breath and every step that I take. It is the heat in my blood and my bones, and the halo that surrounds me when my hair is out, and the sand that falls when I move it. My mother tells me that she loves me. Even when my mouth refuses to stretch over the words that claw at my throat, even when my tongue doesn't bend the way that it needs to, even when the words of a language I don't speak hug me from behind.
Beautiful. Thank you guys so much. Sorry, I do have a last question. Can you share any way that we can support your work? Do you have websites, Instagram handles, TikToks? Please let us know.
To support my work, you can follow me on Instagram at n.r.pillai.
I only have Instagram right now, and it's Amina, AMINAOMOHAMED _.
Beautiful. Okay, so one of the questions in the Q&A that came up is that when you perform spoken word, do you memorize the poetry, do you read it, or do you create it while speaking? A very common question, one that I'm sure you guys are happy to answer.
I memorize my poems for sure. Sometimes I'll like forget a line, so I guess that is creating, but I have such bad stage fright that I cannot get up on stage without knowing for sure what I'm gonna say. So I definitely memorize my poems.
I think what's so funny is I'm the complete opposite, where like I have stage fright, but how I deal with that is through having like my phone or a book as like with my poem, like as a safety blanket. Like I don't think I memorized a poem until a year into doing spoken word, and it was my first time going to SKFOW, and I was like, okay, Namitha, this is a big step. You know, you're a big girl now. You better memorize a poem. And there was so much emphasis from like a member of my team to be like, at SKFOW, like everyone memorizes their poems. Like you better memorize it. And then I went, and it was like fine, and everyone was chill. And it's definitely a different experience when you memorize a poem. But I definitely read stuff. Usually I've practiced it at home, so I don't feel as reliant on it. But I have definitely created poems on the spot. If it's a poem with a repeating line, I'm like, you know what? Just go back to the repeating line, and now the poem is done. And no one knows, so it's fine.
Beautiful. Can you tell me if there are any differences in spoken word between locations? For example, are there differences in America compared to Canada that you know of?
I can't really speak to like other scenes so much. I've definitely noticed differences at the national level versus like my local Ottawa scene. I feel like the national level is a lot more. You have folks that are a lot like just a more diverse group, which like basically boils down to having more BIPOC and not just having a bunch of white people. So you end up with like very deep intersectional like raw poetry that I think feels a lot more relatable and feels a lot more I don't know, valuable. I think when folks share such personal experiences, whereas like I think that I'm lucky that there have been incredible BIPOC in Ottawa and just folks in general that have made for a really welcoming scene. But I definitely have seen that level far more at the national level than in Ottawa.
I agree. Like, I feel like the differences between America and Canada are going to be like obvious because we are two different countries. So I've never, well, obviously I watch button poetry, but I've never been to a performance in America, so I can't tell you exactly what happens there. But there's definitely differences, even just between cities. Like Edmonton, I think our poetry scene is pretty diverse. Like Namitha said, when you go to like different places, you'll see that there are a lot more Black and Indigenous people of color. But yeah, I don't know. I can't really tell you because the only poetry scene that I've seen is in Edmonton, but it's amazing.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to explore that as we go. I've toured across Canada, and it's just like I know that each scene has its own kind of character, but there's also like similarities between scenes, right? You always have like really young people doing really amazing work kind of across the board, and then you have like these pillars of the community who come in and they kind of help people, show them the ropes as they go. And like I think that's true of every community. Okay, so we have another question. When writing spoken word pieces, do you usually go in with an idea that you work from, or do you come up with a piece kind of as you go along the process of writing?
Well, recently I was in a poetry mentorship with the Youth Poet Laureate of Edmonton. So whenever we met up, there was a topic that we write about, and then at the end we had a showcase where we did our poems. So that was really helpful for me. I find that it's really easier for me to write my own poetry when I'm in a group of people, especially when I'm in a group of creatives that I know, because I don't know, I feel like the energy and the vibes that you get from it is immaculate, and it's nothing that you can really recreate. But my poetry, usually what happens is I write like maybe like 4 or 5 lines whenever I feel like it, and then I'll bring it together and I'll link it together by like different sentences, or I'll make it repeating just to make it like more coherent, if that makes sense. But I don't generally go in with an idea. I just kind of write whatever I want throughout like a couple of months, and then I'll put it together.
It definitely varies for me. I've written like entire poems in one day, and I've written like, things over a span of months. The other night, I thought of an idea, but it was like right as I was about to fall asleep. So I like grabbed my phone and left myself a voice note because I knew that I'd forget it the next morning. So it really, really depends. I think that sometimes there's that kind of urgency with like an idea where you're like, oh, I want to write a poem about this idea. But I think for the most part, it definitely starts from a small idea that just kind of grows over time. But I think that for me, at least, it requires a kind of discipline to like sit down and like devote myself to that poem.
Beautiful. Another question, when you are inspired to write from a place of rawness or vulnerability, do you choose to keep the first draft of the poem in its rawest form, or do you revise it?
Oh my god, I revise it. It's probably shit if it's the first draft. No, I definitely don't. I'm like maybe like millennial shit, but I do all my poetry on my laptop and I type it, so I don't even have like a paper copy of my first draft. I mean, like, I guess I could go to like the old edits and see it, but most of the time I don't want to see it. I'm also very hard on myself in a way that is probably not productive at all and not good for me. But no, I definitely just kind of work on stuff. And there's stuff that I've like published in books that I'm like, oh, I just want to rip this up. It's so bad. I would change this line and this line. But I do think there's a kind of beauty in being like, this was me from whatever time ago, and that's what I wrote, and that's okay.
For me, I think my poems are like never finished. Like I'll keep editing them months after they're made, years after they're made. Like it's not like my poem in its first draft. I don't think I have a single poem still written down on paper or even like on my laptop that is still in its first draft. Because anytime I read it, I'm like, what the hell were you thinking? This is trash. Like I don't know who you thought you were gonna show this to. I don't know where you thought you were gonna take this, but nobody wants to see this. You have to edit it or you're gonna have to throw it out. So there's so many like things that I've like so many drafts that I have of different poems, and I just don't share them and I don't save them because I hate seeing them because they make me so angry. But yeah, my poetry is never done. Like I'll keep editing it and editing it until like it's written down on in like a book or whatever. And even then I'll probably get the book and like annotate it on the margins. Like I hate this.
Okay, so we have a question. Do you ever have difficulty realizing an idea for a poem? If you do, what do you do to help coax it out? Do you shelf it until you are more inspired, or do you push through?
I find that when I just force myself to write stuff, even if I don't think it's good at the moment, I'll come back to it a different like unless I have like a time limit, I'm never gonna really try and like force myself to finish a poem. Like if I'm sitting there and I only have 1 line and I want to get to like 5 lines, I'll just write whatever down and I'll come back to it a different day. And sometimes it'll be better, and sometimes I'll hate it, but just depends on my mood of the day. So I don't know. I get writer's block a lot. So I just try to like meditate, relax, do some skincare, wash my face, come back, sit down. If I still hate it, like just come back to it like a different month or whatever.
That's so real. Oh my god, I love that. I think for me, I think there's a time and place for both for pushing through and writing, like even if you don't want to. But also, I think that again, I think that I'm very hard on myself, and I think that sometimes it becomes very counterproductive when I force myself to do things like that. But I think sometimes if I do want to kind of coax it out, I think that I try to read um, one, either poetry that talks about that topic, or if it's about a certain topic, to just learn more about it. For example, I've been meaning to write this poem about, I took this abolition class like last semester, and I've been meaning to write this poem about Angela Davis, like way before this big wave of everyone. Like, I'm not just hopping on the bandwagon, but also everyone deserves to be on that bandwagon. Angela Davis is wonderful. But I just like read a Wikipedia page about Angela Davis and just like consumed. I think that just like knowing more information about a topic just gives you more to work with and gives you more inspiration to maybe write about things in a way or at an angle that you maybe didn't before.
Beautiful. And I think we're going to stop with this question, but you both talked about responsibility as a performer and writer. Can you go into more detail about what that means to you personally, and if you ever felt the need to censor yourself for the audience?
Definitely. I think that the times that I have had to censor myself, I think I don't, I maybe do so begrudgingly. I feel like the times I've had to censor myself is maybe not because of a sense of responsibility, but more out of a kind of pressure. I've like been in spaces and I've like seen kids in the audience, and I'm like, okay, I don't want to make their parents deal with this like hard conversation, whatever. I just like won't talk about sex. But I think that being uncomfortable and I think acknowledging privilege has been something that I've definitely been grappling with, and what that looks like for me. So whether that's, you know, a space where, you know, certain voices aren't being amplified or are getting a platform, like stepping down and saying, you know what, I'm not the most educated on this, like this person should be there instead, and giving those kinds of resources or those names of other folks, I think is really important. So I think that knowledge that you maybe are not the most educated on something is something that might be difficult, but is deeply necessary.
For me, I'm a very emotional person. Like, so when I feel like I don't know something, or I feel like I'm not safe in a space, and I feel like I don't feel comfortable sharing this with people because I think that they'll judge me, or because I don't think they are the kind of people that I would like to share what I'm saying with, I'll definitely like censor myself, and I'll definitely take stuff out of my poem, and I'll change it up and whatever, because like I said, like your poem is never done. And if you don't, there's no shame in not feeling comfortable doing something and changing up your whole plan because of it. And I do that all the time. So yeah.
Beautiful. Any closing thoughts you want to leave the online Festival of Words community with?
I think thank you for having this space. I think that having this space be like this panel just be BIPOC, I think is really important and really valuable. And I think that there are very infrequently spaces like this, and I think that it allows for a kind of discussion that doesn't happen the same way or doesn't happen as naturally with white folks. So yeah.
I don't have anything to leave you guys with, but thank you. I love meeting you, Namitha. You're really great. I'm going to follow you on Instagram, so watch out for that. Also, I don't know, I guess like drink water, stay hydrated, stay nice, respect the Black Indigenous people in your city, donate to them. I don't know. That's all I have for you.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in, for coming out. I hope it was enlightening. It was interesting. I was deeply interested in hearing from these two poets. I love them both so much. And so I'm really excited that I got to work with the Festival of Words again this year. And hopefully next year we will be able to meet in person and bond over slam and spoken word and continue to do the amazing work that we're still doing with the festival. Thank you everyone for coming out. Have a good night.